Well, if you didn't have enough food for thought this morning, or enough of that delicious food for lunch, we have an amazing afternoon for you. But before we do that, we are going to do something we should have done this morning, which is to let a little bit of Fordham Law School welcome you. And so first, I'm going to introduce Professor Catherine Powell, who is a person who has spent her life both inside of academia and inside the government, thinking about the issues that destabilize the world and ways to restabilize the world. She's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a professor here. She has set up programs at not just here, but at Columbia, at Georgetown. Who knows what else she may do. She is thinking these days about new areas of human rights and the way in which troubled communities find voices and give power to those who are disenfranchised globally. She is a pleasure to work with. And without further ado, Catherine Powell.
Thank you, Karen. Karen really just asked me to say a word about Matt Diller, the Dean of Fordham Law School, who's been a real leader in bridging the world of policy and ideas in social welfare law, his field of expertise, and who's been a big supporter of centers like the Center for the National Security, for assembling programs like this with vital experts like those of you here. A big supporter for members of the faculty like me who took a leave of absence to be a political appointee in the Obama administration, and most importantly of our students and alums who, and our commitment to the Fordham's commitment to public sector and public justice, to be leaders not only in the public sector, private sector and the private bar, but also government here in New York City, the state, the national government, and international institutions. So it's with great enthusiasm that I introduce the Dean of Fordham Law School. Sorry, I was just at Yale recently speaking. The Dean of Fordham Law School, Matt Diller.
Thank you. So yes, I'm here for a couple of very precise purposes, and I know you have a great afternoon of discussion and conversation awaiting. So first is, yes, to remind you that you are here at Fordham Law School and to welcome you. I hope you feel pretty welcome at this point in the day. And I'll just point out that we are very privileged to gather in what for us is a new building, a new facility. The building opened a year ago in September, and as you can see, it's really fabulous. So I invite you to explore the building, check out the terrace that we're incredibly proud of, and explore around. And then the second point that I want to make is really to talk about our Center for National Security and how important it is to me and to the law school. Fordham's hallmark has always been an engaged approach to legal education. We teach our students to be focused on solving real-world problems and focusing and addressing issues that matter most. It's the hallmark of our faculty. In the service of others is the motto of the school, and we take it very seriously. And toward that end, the Center for National Security is a remarkable institution that we are pleased to have as part of our school. And I want to take a moment, and I know you will join me in this, to thank Karen Greenberg for putting together such a remarkable program. And I want to just praise her own work and leadership, both in the center and in focusing us on the really tough challenges we have, and in navigating us, helping to navigate us through them in a really quite plausible and reasonable way. I say plausible and reasonable way because I think that is the most actually one can hope for in this world on this set of issues that are so challenging and have so many different tensions between them. I know that today's program is focused on looking back over the past 15 and 16 years or so since 9/11. There's obviously a huge amount, a sea change in the relationship between national security and our democratic institutions has really taken place. I know Many of you devote your careers and much of your professional time to focusing on these issues. One thing I want to put on your radar screen is that on May 24th, Karen's book on the subject, Rogue Justice, The Rise of the National Security State, is coming out. And so you can continue to pursue your deep interest in this subject by reading Karen's book, which I am very much looking forward to myself, and which will be a major contribution to the field. Have a good and productive afternoon. Thank you all.
All right, so thank you for that, Dean Diller. I really do appreciate it. And thank you for this beautiful room that you built just for the center. We know that, so that we can have our events. So let's turn to this afternoon's panel. One of the topics that wove its way through the conversation this morning, whether we were talking about the NYPD or whether we were talking about the White House, is foreign policy. You cannot talk about terrorism, counterterrorism, and how to be secure in the future and balancing or not balancing liberty and security without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the foreign policy elephant. The person who's going to lead this panel, as I said, our moderators are experts in the field, is somebody who is as much an expert in the challenging part of the world that we are dealing with, and particularly the Middle East, than Steve Simon. Steve Simon's books, along with his co-author, Dan Benjamin, on Al-Qaeda, what Al-Qaeda was, how it came about within the foreign policy discussion, is required reading for anybody who wants to know about the Age of Terror. The book was called The Age of Sacred Terror. It came out practically on 9/11. It was prescient in much of what it had been looking into. And one of the things I always say about understanding experts in the war on terror, and so many of you have heard it before, is that there are those people like Ali Soufan and Richard Clarke and a number of other people you hear from today who were thinking about terrorism well before 9/11. There weren't a lot, but there were some. Those people became extremely important in helping us figure out the world as it was. And today, although there are a lot of newcomers to the field in the post-9/11 world, including myself, it's still important to go back and to find the threads that only they can connect, because they've lived it, they've experienced it, they've been thinking about it for a long time. I could tell you a lot of other things about Steve Simon, like he teaches at Dartmouth. He's going to teach at Amherst. He is a national treasure. Any president or president-to-be who doesn't contact him is not thinking straight. They will talk to him. They will talk to him about Syria. They will talk to him about Israel. They will talk to him about the difficult places in the world. And with that, Steve, I turn the panel over to you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that kind introduction, Karen. It's really great to be here and to see such a full house. The topics today are hugely important, and it's great to see that there are so many people who acknowledge that importance and vote with their feet and come out to hear some interesting people talk about these ideas. This panel it does consist of very interesting people. I mean, myself included. Just kidding. Starting at the far end of the panel through Emma, who is right next to Gideon, where you are looking at people who are both men and women of thought as well as action. When you hear the term boots on the ground, these three individuals actually wore them. And in very hazardous ground indeed, and have not only a great deal of intellectual reflection on that experience to share, but they actually, of course, lived that experience. And what they say, it really behooves us to pay close attention to. Gideon Rose, to my immediate left, is the editor of the premier foreign policy journal, one that is not a newcomer to the field. It's been the premier journal for, I don't know, 70 years? I don't know how long. 95 years. There you have it. He not only brings the best and sometimes most controversial thinking about foreign policy and related areas, the new security agenda as well as the old, to the attention of the American public, but he himself is a deep thinker on these matters and has written engrossing books that have shaped thinking on international affairs and U.S. foreign policy in the post-war period. So it's a really fabulous panel. I'm going to say one or two introductory remarks and then turn it over to the panel, starting with General Jacoby at the. Is he at the far end? Nope. He's not. We'll start with Doug Ollivant and then move towards me. Okay, we are charged with looking at the foreign policy challenges that face the next president, or will face the next president, whoever he or she might be. The topic spurred just a couple of thoughts, which I'd like to share by way of preamble or introduction. The last great scourge in the Middle East, which it's a scourge that now sounds like a sort of just a bad cold or a bit of a rash, was Arab nationalism. In those days it was personified by the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in 1956. He nationalized the Suez Canal, a daring act of bravado and a manifestation of his sort of nationalist instincts. Well, the Prime Minister of Britain, Anthony Eden, wouldn't stand for that. Britain was the policeman of the Middle East at that point, and he figured, somebody needed to give Nasser a bloody nose, both as a way of getting him to back off and as a way of undermining his prestige in the region by demonstrating that, compared to the traditional powers, he was all show, no go. Well, things didn't work out as planned. It was Britain that got the bloody nose. And as the London Times summed up the situation in a 1977 obituary for Anthony Eden, which some of you have probably seen, they said, Eden was the last prime minister to believe that Britain was a great power and the first to confront a crisis which proved she was not. Ouch. It's just too tempting to substitute George W. Bush for Eden and the U.S. for the U.K. in that encomium. Now, I don't know what our panelists will have to say about the Middle East foreign policy challenges that will immediately confront the new president in January, but whatever they say, whatever these challenges are thought to be, the president will face a region that is less available to U.S. influence and govern an American public that simply isn't very interested in doing stuff overseas. And owing in part to the high cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, he or she will have a lot less money to spend. Now, we're also supposed to look at how the U.S. government is structured to deal with non-state actors. And that's clearly a question a lot of people have given thought to since JFK sent Green Berets into Vietnam in the early 60s. But a couple of things I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on. No obligation, by the way, to do this, but just, I'll catch you later if you don't want to address these thoughts on the panel. But one of the things that worries me or concerns me is whether thinking in terms of non-state actors is really an appropriate category of analysis. I mean, if you look at the Muslim Brothers, they are a political party and they want to run a real live state or states. ISIS considers itself to be a state and structures itself accordingly. So I kind of wonder if non-state actor is really the right way of thinking about this. The other thing, lastly, is in terms of how the U.S. is structured, I think we need to think about what drives ISIS, if that's the non-state actor we're talking about dealing with. To the extent you think that that the drivers of ISIS are socioeconomic in some fundamental sense, bad governance, political exclusion, corruption, joblessness, and underemployment, crumbling infrastructures, chaotic public finances, environmental degradation, lousy education, bad services, public services, food and water insecurity. How is the U.S. structured to deal with those things? Now, those are very big things, and the United States is a big country, but there are limits to how big it is. So I think we need to think about how to structure ourselves to deal with that. Otherwise, all our responses presumably will be mostly palliative and mostly military. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Doug. We'll talk among ourselves for about an hour and maybe a little bit less, so we have about a half an hour for Q&A. So judge your time accordingly.
Sure. Very quick opening statement then. I think that what we are seeing in the region, in the Middle East, is a new generation of transition from authoritarian rule. We saw this in Latin America in the 80s. We saw it in Southern Europe in the 70s. We are seeing it now in the Middle East. The issue, of course, is that these states have far, far fewer resources to deal with these types of transitions, make them peaceful, make them seamless, make them less ambiguous. So we have three working cases right now. We have Iraq, where the regime change was brought about totally externally. We have Syria, where the change, such as it is being brought about totally internally, though there are all some, certainly with no U.S. effort, there are some external actors. And we have Libya, which is kind of half and half, in which a indigenous rebellion against the government was certainly aided by external actors. The commonality is in none of these three cases is it going terribly well. We do see, some streams of hope, but as I tell people, we now see in Iraq perhaps the worst representative democracy on the planet, although that's a very competitive category. But nonetheless, it is a representative democracy, a not very good one that is having a lot of trouble dealing with sectarianism, invasion, poverty, a whole host of issues inside that country with very nascent institutions and not a great track record of how they got there. Nonetheless, they are dealing with and as I put it in, to think of them as an individual, they are very, very tumultuous adolescents going through all the pain of these growing pains and not really having the issues, the ability to deal with them. The other states in the region, by comparison, are still toddlers. They have not yet begun this movement into transition from authoritarian rule. But where the Iraqis are today, the Gulf states will be going. The Gulf states have been able to buy their way out of transition, maintain their authoritarian rule through the use of large amounts of petrodollars. Even that wasn't sustainable, I don't believe, but certainly the fact that petrodollars are now much, much harder to come by means that the lifespan of these authoritarian regimes is now significantly less than it was. So while President Obama may very, very much want to disengage from the Middle East and not have anything to do with it, I suspect that his successor will be equally unsuccessful in disengaging from a continuing line of problems that come down the road. Revolution was beat down in Iran. It was beat down in Bahrain. I strongly suspect that in both of those countries we will see it again during the next 8 years of either one president or two. So having thrown that statement out on the table, let me talk very, very briefly about the second topic we were asked to speak on, the role of sub-state actors and the U.S. government's ability to deal with that. This is clearly a huge lacuna in U.S. government institutions. We have no one set out to deal with sub-state actors, no one who is trained to do that. Our State Department deals with states, as its names imply. It is not the Department of Sub-State Actors, it is the Department of State, and therefore it is optimized, organized, set up It recruits, trains, so that its representatives can deal with the representatives of other states. That's not a weakness, that's what it does. However, when it tries to set up something inside itself, what we used to call SCRS, which is now the Bureau for Conflict and Stability Operations, it's not entirely clear how that fits inside an organization that is optimized to speak to other states. And when you put someone who comes out of that bureaucracy in charge of this new subsection, they're a little confused as to why this bureau exists inside a organization that is set up to deal with other states. And I'm not going to just pick on the State Department. Obviously, the Department of Defense has the same problem. We used to have a more honest name for the Department of Defense, the Department of War, and departments of wars do wars. The Pentagon is not the department of how you put things back together after there is a war. It is optimized to fight wars, as we saw both in the 1991 Gulf War and the initial invasion of Iraq. It actually does that quite well. What we see, though, is a lacuna that is left in the aftermath where the Defense Department is not organized, trained, doesn't think about putting that back together, and the State Department does not either. To you. Okay.
My name's Chuck Jacoby, and I'm a retired general officer in the United States Army. And my last job, I was a commander of U.S. Northern Command and North American Aerospace Defense Command. Before I did that, I spent a year in Iraq as the last Corps commander during the period of the parliamentary elections in 2010, getting out of the cities, implementing the security agreement, and really beginning transition, what we thought would be transition from our military activities in Iraq to a more normal relationship with a maturing state. So I have a couple of things to say about the questions that Stephen proposed, but I really want to speak to you and answer your questions as a retired military guy and the role that the military can play, has played in foreign policy and in our national security apparatus. And I'll talk briefly about that in the setup commentary. But in terms of the non-state actor question, I really do think that's an important question because we have to transition that question from the buzzword world to some meaningful discussions and think about our institutions for national security and how they're organized and prepared to deal with what we're calling non-state actors. As your homeland commander, Northern Command, in a very short period of time that I had it from 2011 to 2014, it became increasingly apparent throughout my command that the country is becoming more and more vulnerable to non-traditional threats than it ever has been in the past. And so we've always had the luxury of great oceans and time, and the ability to focus inward when it was our inclination to do so and try to distance ourselves from what others might try to entangle us in globally. But now we find that those oceans have shrunk, that problems globally now reflect themselves into the homeland, not just at the speed of a jet or the speed of an ICBM, but now at the speed of light with a cyber, for instance. So when I think about the question of non-state actors, it's more, to me, how are our strategic choices complicated and compromised by the ability of these types of threats to hold our country at risk, our homeland at risk. It really drives us to a new calculus of how we think about security. So people would say, well, you're the homeland commander. Why do you care about ISIS? I care about ISIS because we think of it now as something that can reflect on our security interests in the homeland. Well, why do you care about climate change? Because I'm the guy that has to respond to hurricanes and the tornadoes that rip their way through Oklahoma. Why do you care about cyber? And it's because our our potential adversaries are on our nets right now, and they're increasingly vulnerable, and we're increasingly dependent on them. And so there really are very few issues that can't cause us to be concerned for our security at home in a very fundamentally different way than we've done so in the past. So that's why the NORTHCOM commander was just as worried about ISIS as the CENTCOM commander, or just as worried about North Korean possession of nuclear weapons as the PACOM commander, and just about worried about anybody that could get on a net and get on our SCADA systems and challenge us in the cyber arena. So I just wanted to kind of frame that up. It was relevant to me as a NORTHCOM commander, as well as when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2004 and 5. I do want to briefly touch on, I would say, one big question that I'm sure we won't return to, but if I did get a chance to talk to the new president, is directly related to the question about what to do in the Middle East. I think there's an opportunity for a new president and an administration to refresh the civil-military relationship in the United States, and I think that's critically important. He's going to find a military that is obedient.
She is going to find.
Yes. We teed each other up for this. I told her I'd say that, and she would correct me, and then we'd get that point across. And I will continue to do so you may continue to do that. We served together in Iraq, and I'm
I
proud
would never
to be here.
interrupt you when you were in uniform.
Yeah, that's what happens. You take the uniform off, and everything goes away. I think he or she will find a very professional military, ready to adopt the priorities of the new administration, ready to follow presidential intent and give professional advice. And I think that it's very important that as the new president looks across the canvas of concerns, national security concerns for the country, that one of those concerns not be the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership. And I know that we have a bridging function that we can play, and most of the senior military leaders are fresh caught. I mean, if you're tracking timelines, Joe Dunford's brand new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We have brand new combatant commanders in the field, and we have brand new chiefs of service, and everyone's eager to refresh and get started on the right foot of that relationship. The new president will also find that the military is very aware that they are not the single solution to any problem, and that only a comprehensive approach is going to provide for the comprehensive security our nation and our friends and allies require in the future. And so we'll be very eager to partner with new heads of agencies, new players in the national security landscape. And I think it's important, it would be important for the president to have that conversation early and understand that relationship and the depth of it right at the beginning, right as he or she starts taking on these questions about what are my first priorities in the Middle East or my first priorities in the Pacific, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
You started off mentioning Suez and how Suez ended Britain's moment in the Middle East. And I think the next president is still going to be faced with the consequences of the Iraq War and the impact the Iraq War had on the region. And the Iraq War and the way in which we departed Iraq left the state weak and enabled the resurgence of Iran. And so this changed the balance of power in the region in Iran's favor and has triggered this intense, enhanced geopolitical competition between Iran on the one hand and Saudi and the Gulfies on the other, which has been leading to their support for these extreme sectarian actors in different countries, turning what are local grievances over poor governance into these regional proxy wars. So understanding that is key, because obviously the Iraq War has done huge damage to US reputation and has had these unintended consequences that we see in the region. You can look at civil wars now in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya. And it's in the, when you have these environments, when you have a failed state, when you have ungoverned spaces, this creates the chaotic conditions that allows a group such as ISIS to flourish. Also to understand the failures of the Arab regimes, which is not new, this has been going on for decades. These Arab regimes, many of them, have failed to meet the demands of their populations, which are increasingly young and interconnected. And so they have not been able to respond to the socioeconomic needs. You can see in a number of countries how post-colonial elites didn't make use of the opportunities that they had to build up their societies. And instead, they focused on protecting their own regimes. And liberals, instead of contesting that, went along with, that framework really is the regimes would provide them with security, because the regimes kept saying it's either us or it's the terrorists, us or the extremists. When the Arab Spring broke out, there was great hopes at the beginning, and you could see across the region a sense of connectedness, a demand for dignity, a voice, space for politics, hopes that there really would be these reforms, new elections, new social contracts. In a number of countries, the regimes have managed to manipulate and increase divisions within society, and the region has become more polarized and more divided. I think it's only in Tunisia where you can see that the situation today is better than before the status quo. And it's radical Islam, which has really been the only ideological platform that's been able to mobilize disenfranchised populations against the status quo. And over the years, Saudi and the Gulf states have funded schools, have funded preachers going abroad, preaching a very sort of Salafi version of Islam. And there's not really been anything to counter that. Before, you could see state support for Sufism. I haven't seen that for quite a while. So all of these, these revolutions which are taking place in the Middle East, these are going to take years and years to play out. And it's all happening when there's, in the information era, it's 24/7 news. Got, this was said before, the very young population demanding dignity. When you ask young people in the region what sort of region they want to live in, most will describe, something like Dubai rather than Daesh, rather than ISIS. So it's a very difficult time. And I think if you, in the United States, if you ask Congress today to draft a constitution, I just can't see that happening. They can't agree on anything. And so, you think these changes are taking place in the Middle East during this era where power is diffused. You see vertical hierarchies are breaking down, a much more horizontal interconnectedness, which make it all very difficult. And the challenge for the next president is to have good analysis of the situation, to understand what really is going on, and to identify where it is that the US can have influence. And that really is a challenge. And I'll pass it on to Gideon to answer.
Thanks, Emma. That's the easy one. Okay. I guess what I would say is the way I come at this is taking everything that the previous speakers have said as factually correct and the basic situation that we're confronting. The larger question becomes, how much of this is our problem and how much do we have to actually do with it? There's no question that the Middle East is extraordinarily messed up right now. And the question is not, and the disagreement tends to be not about how messed up it is or in what ways it's messed up, but about whether there's anything that we can or should do about that. Over the course of, you might say, an extended first half of the 20th century, the United States went from a continental and hemispheric power to a global power. It essentially accepted not just that it would play a major role in the globe, but by the end of that extended first half of the 20th century, it recognized that the only way to make sure that its external global environment was relatively safe was to take fundamental security questions out of the hands of Europeans, out of the hands of Asians, and essentially provide the public good of security and stability and some trading mechanisms for large swaths of the industrialized world. And we're still living in that basic world now. Over the course of the half century after that, the question about whether to add the Middle East to Europe and East Asia as essentially an American protectorate was on the agenda. First, the British withdrew. Second, oil became, and energy became ever more central, and Middle Eastern oil and Gulf oil in particular became ever more central to the global economy. And then you had turmoil in the region. And so gradually over the course of the third quarter of the century, the United States got sucked in to playing the British role of guarantor for the region, replacing the British. You ended up with the, the Carter Doctrine. Then over the course of dual containment and the end of the Cold War, we ended up playing a more direct role ourselves. And this culminates essentially in the first decade of the 21st century, in which we're essentially policing the region, determining regime type directly ourselves, and essentially putting a, whether you want to call it a colony, whether you want to call it a trusteeship, essentially trying to order the Middle East in perpetuity in a definitive way with us as the outside power, not dissimilarly to what we did in Europe and Asia. Well, a few things. One, it didn't work well. The raw material was much more recalcitrant than we had expected. The planning and the execution was grossly incompetent and screwed up. The political basis wasn't there. And other developments occurred as well. We had energy revolutions in the US. And you face a situation now in which something that was kind of taken for granted in at least the strategic community of the US foreign policy establishment over the last couple of decades, which is that the United States should play a major role organizing Middle Eastern affairs the way it had essentially Europe and Asia, is now back in fundamental question again, because we're clearly retrenching and pulling back. And our attempt to be much more involved was clearly not particularly successful and was highly costly and deeply unpopular. And so the question of should we, in effect, re-up now that there's new trouble in the region and do it better and with a lighter touch and more sensitively and more effectively, but still actually take on the job of policing the Middle East once again, and this time do it right? Or should we continue to pull back and basically say this is a region that we can deal with from the outskirts, that we can deal with via a kind of offshore balancing, and it's not necessarily something that's fundamentally within the walls of the American imperium. That is the big question. There are actually a couple of pieces in FA recently, one by Steve and Jonathan Stevenson, and one by Ken Pollack in the issue afterward, Fight or Flight, which is a little more along Emma's lines. I'm sort of sitting between Steve and Emma, and I know they actually disagree to a certain extent about this very question that I'm talking about. And there's a good argument to be made that the problems of the Middle East, all the ones that were just laid out, are not going to be solved by the locals without significant external help. Just as Europe couldn't solve its internal security dilemmas, just as Asia couldn't solve its internal security dilemmas, there's a need for the United States to have a prolonged, benign, deep involvement with the region to not just deal with the bad actors, but midwife good, healthy regimes that can ultimately be civilized members of the world community. There's also now a school which basically says, you know what, that's much harder and more difficult than we had expected. We've already tried and screwed it up once. We're not going to get another good second chance. The American public doesn't want that. The energy revolution is occurring at a pace in which we may not need Middle Eastern energy resources for as interminably long as we had expected, only maybe 2 or 3 more decades. And maybe we can get by sort of just banking the coals, cauterizing the wounds, dealing with this on the outside, and not actually getting deeply involved. Steve, who writes a lot of things these days, wrote an excellent book that's just come out with Ray Takei about the U.S. in the Middle East during the Cold War. And one of the crucial themes of that was we dealt with the Middle East in the Cold War because it was a crucial theater in the Cold War. Well, there isn't a Cold War anymore. And so it's not entirely clear why we have to deal with this region now in a way, because we don't necessarily care who rules Ramadi. We don't necessarily care whether the Houthis are on top or not. And at least we don't care as much as the locals do. And since the locals don't particularly want us determining things, this is really a very big question. One could make an argument, not just that we need to bring in foreign policy into the terrorism discussion, but they need to bring in some other areas, whether it's energy policy, whether it's intelligence gathering. Because you could imagine, and I would say this is the fundamental question that the next president is going to have to engage. Do you want to try to deal with all the problems in the Middle East that were just laid out directly and on the ground and in close partnership with the regimes that exist and trying to make things better? Or do you want to continue the retrenchment that has been gradually taking place from the region in the last few years and deal with the problems of the region indirectly through massive research in renewable energy, lifting your bans on fracking, supplying a much larger energy market that will actually decrease our reliance and the globe's reliance in the Middle East for a long time, security cooperation that sort of slaps down problems and prevents attacks outside from occurring, things that basically don't deal with the root causes, lets the region's pathologies play out over decades, generations, and tries to shield the U.S. from the consequences as much as possible. That's the fundamental question. And we're just beginning to confront it. And if you say this in DC, people would look at me and say, that's ridiculous, it's absurd, you're a neo-isolationist idiot, how can you be doing this? And if you were to go to some of the places where Sanders and Trump are doing well, they would say the exact opposite. Of course, we should have done that a long time ago. And the fact that the establishment is now finally, the national security establishment is finally starting to grapple with this is really good and healthy. But that's the big question about Middle East policy. It's not what should we do about specific issue X. It's how much of this is our problem. The Middle East is a dangerous, sort of rambunctious homeless guy on the Upper West Side running around the street, occasionally doing bad things to pedestrians. How much is that our problem? And what do we do? Do we do massive treatment? Do we adopt the person and bring him in? Do we lock him up? Do we occasionally police the region? We don't know how to deal with that domestically as much, and we certainly don't know how to do it on foreign policy. But the fundamental question of whether the Middle East is an American protectorate or not, in a direct way, is the key question.
Okay.
We know who you are.
Disagree with that, by the way?
Yeah, that was a tour de force. That was terrific, Gideon. And it leads me to ask, starting with you, but I'd be interested just as much in the views of the other members of the panel, which way the new administration is going to go. You know, option one or option two. And secondly, is option one even an available option?
So I'm going to leave much of the answer to these questions to you guys who actually do it more, and I'm particularly curious in your take on this. I would say that the interesting question about what you said, the first question, which is, what will the Hillary administration do? It's very interesting because it comes down to a judgment about, first, whether you think some of her quote-unquote hawkishness has been substantive and genuine, or whether it's been the response of a Democrat in the post-Vietnam era to seeming to do what is necessary to get elected in a tough environment in a dangerous world. Because now that the political tides are shifting against intervention, if it was primarily political and coloring, if foreign policy hawkishness was the fundamental equivalent of tough on crime in the 80s and 90s, then just as it meant you go forward in that direction in the 90s, but you pull back now, so maybe that's what's going to happen on foreign policy. We don't know, or I don't know. You would know more because you've worked with these guys, and so might Emma. The other question is, are there actual solutions? Ken Pollack, who's a good friend of a lot of ours, who's worked closely with Emma, I think Ken is the best proponent of what you might say a wise and enlightened neocolonialism in a positive way. He laid it out in a good book called Path Out of the Desert. He lays it out in the newest article that I said, sort of here's where we should go more and do more in the next thing. I recommend these things because they're the best case you can make for what that new kind of deep involvement would look like. And I love Ken dearly. I've known him for decades. I've written with him. I look at his stuff and I go, this is the best case that can be made, and I just don't see how it works. It just is a recipe at this point for thankless, endless involvement that they don't want, we don't want, and that doesn't ultimately work. And therefore, I come towards pulling back. But the response to that from Ken, and you've heard it as well, and I'm sure Emma will say it is, well, if you do that, the problem's just going to fester, and they'll come at us, and you can't walk away, you can't leave this there. And I think the answer is, yeah, okay, you can't, but then just deal with the consequences if and when they come over here, and let it burn out as much as possible and play out over there. Because we don't know how to solve it, even if we wanted to. Emma?
We just can't help ourselves. So there's no way that we will sit doing nothing because we can't help ourselves.
We've done nothing on Syria.
Well, we're starting to, aren't we? It starts. I mean, I think the thing is we never ask, why do we lose our wars? We've lost quite a few wars. When did we last win a war? So we're quite capable of losing wars without anybody asking, why do we lose our wars? Why does the country with the greatest military in the world, the greatest military that the world has ever seen, lose its wars? And nobody's held accountable. Nobody's been held accountable for the decision to go to war in Iraq, the mismanagement of the occupation, or the way in which we just withdrew from Iraq before we started to go back again because we can't help ourselves. And, for people who study these things, they can see the same patterns repeated over and over again. So I start knowing that we can't help ourselves, that we will get sucked back in. I could also say that if what happened in the Middle East stayed in the Middle East, you could argue a really good case for just staying out. But what happens in the Middle East isn't contained in the Middle East. You've got ISIS spreading out, you've got refugees flowing out. Is the outcome of the Iraq War going to be the unraveling of the Middle East, the meltdown of the European Union, and the end of Pax Americana that maintained stability for 70 years throughout the world? I think there's a lot of people who won't want to see that as the outcome. And so in a way, there'll always be those like Ken who will come up with these great ideas of how we can do things better. Which also, as you said, Ken writes the best argument for that, but it's easy to poke holes in it. Could think back on 9/11, how many bad guys were there in the world? 100, couple of hundred. 15 years of our global war on terror has led to a proliferation of terrorists and terrorist groups. Is that because of what we do, or is that regardless of what we do? So I think some of these fundamental questions haven't been addressed. You can think in America since 9/11, I think it's something, Peter Bergen, if he'll know the figures, it's something like 250,000 Americans have been killed in America by gun homicides, 45 killed by Muslims. And yet, the way the media, the politicians portray things creates this fear. We must do something. They create the fear, then they say they're going to go and save us and rescue us from that fear. So I don't think we're capable of staying out. The question is how to have a coherent, rational policy. I think the Obama administration has tried to do what you would call the second policy. That has led to a power vacuum in the Middle East that's being filled by actors such as Putin, Iran, ISIS, people that we don't like. Some will argue that the Middle East will find a natural balance of power after much bloodshedding like Europe did. Europe ended up with the Treaty of Westphalia. Personally, I don't believe the Middle East will reach a natural balance of power. I think it really will keep going down, down, down and dragging everybody else in. But that said, it is really hard to come up with a coherent policy that sees the US not as occupying the Middle East with lots of ground forces, but trying to play a role much more of balancer in chief, so helps put balance back between Iran and Saudi, helps to try and de-escalate, because they mobilize people using sectarianism, so to try and de-escalate some of that. How can we set incentives for regimes to reform, rather than going back to our old model of supporting authoritarian regimes, selling them loads of weapons? I mean, it's happy days for the defense industry. It seems that every group in the Middle East has got US weapons, from ISIS, the Shia militias, to all the states. So how can we break out of that model? And, how can we set economic incentives to try and get the region as an economic hub that is trading with economic area like the European Union, so it's trading within as well? These are really difficult, challenging questions, and we have to be hugely aware of our limitations. The Middle East has got a trajectory of its own. There's certain things that we can influence, for good or for bad, but we have to be aware of our limitations.
General Jacoby? Yeah, I like the way you framed up the problem. I mean, you gave us two polar extremes there, I think, and or two competing ideas. And I think that as we're talking about national security today, and we're talking about a future president, I'm sure we get asked for other options. And so the other options would be, varying degrees of effort in between. I think when you look when you consider, though, the two polar opposites there, stay the course and continue engagement like we all instinctively want to do, or pull out and leave everyone to their own devices like some of us instinctively would like to do. I think that you're really making choices between being a big country and a great country. So if you're a big enough country, you can go ahead and engage as much as you want to and bear the consequences and continue on the path that worked for our forefathers. Also, if you're a big country, you can say, to hell with it, I can ignore it, and I can frack away and live in our fortress here. And you can probably make that argument for any place in the world where you run into difficulties in trying to have things work out well for your friends and allies around the world. I think being a great country is finding the right balance. So I'm really kind of echoing Emma's point here, is that I did not do a good enough job kind of laying out that as a Homeland guy, I don't think there's anything that we can ignore that second and third order effects can't reach us in the Homeland and make it our business. You can think of very few reasons to send a large land army someplace in the world, but there are folks that do not have our interest at heart that could think of ways to get us to do that, a lot of ways, in this city and in other cities. And so I do think that there is a difference between choosing the two opposite extremes of being a big country and trying to find out that balance that makes us a great country and allows us to contribute to stability and peace and contribute to helping our friends in the region, or just walking away. Thanks.
Doug?
There's great wisdom in what Gideon has to say. I think the answer, of course, is going to be, it's not either or. I think it's going to be both or a little bit of neither. You know, I'm all about getting a North American energy grid put together. I'm all about helping out the Mexicans with the cartels the same way we help out the Middle East with ISIL. That needs to be done. That's a necessary strategy we should move forward on. And making, you know, having North America first, given that we live here, makes all kind of sense. I think the next step is we need to rationally look at our interests in the region. You know, let's start with Afghanistan, which most people don't consider part of the Middle East, but the military does. So we'll start there. You know, we are now looking at spending in perpetuity somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 billion, with a B, dollars annually to maintain our 10-ish thousand soldiers in Afghanistan. For those of you who don't deal with government numbers, $40 billion is about 2/3 of what we spend each year on either the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security. Take your pick. Each of those run at about $60 billion per. So we're talking at somewhere from half to 2/3 of the budget of these two institutions just to stabilize Afghanistan. Now, I spent a year in Afghanistan. I love the Afghan people. It's a wonderful country. I'm not sure the United States has $30 billion annually worth of interest in that country. And we need to start thinking rationally about this rather than simply continuing what we've been doing. Just because an attack was launched from there 15 years ago does not mean that 15 years later we still have interest, or at least $30 billion worth of interest. But then it's going to be looking at the consequences of disengaging. You know, let's look at one that's coming up this summer. You know, once the Mediterranean settles down, which should happen in the next month or so, assuming that Libya is not stabilized during the next 30 days, which I think we can also safely stipulate, we're going to see another wave of refugees coming across the Mediterranean to the southern shores of Greece and Italy. I suspect the president would call this the convergence of the free riders, the Middle East free riders and our European friends, whom he also sees as security free riders. And I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I've heard it from the White House. That said, are we going to just sit here and watch millions of refugees wash up on Greece and Italy's shores with the concomitant number that will die as they're trying to cross the Mediterranean, large, drownings probably in the thousands? Are we prepared for that? Are we going to watch that happen? It's difficult for me to see a United States that is not going to engage that one way or another. And at one level, that's very admirable, and at another level, as Emma said, we just can't not.
Okay, an interesting array of views, really. The idea that we'll just get sucked in willy-nilly. I mean, I think that certainly is Doug and Emma. Emma saying, well, we can't resist. We can't fight it.
So, I think that there's two reasons why we get sucked in. One is because there's some functional logic that, based on interest, that may not be always apparent in people's minds, but is actually there, and so that when those interests get threatened, the natural functional logic of the American Imperium brings people to bear, say we have to actually stop this. So in retrospect, the debate over whether we would respond to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait if you go back and look at that period right now, it looks like a no-brainer. Like, why was there even discussion? You had a guy with 10% of global energy reserves suddenly invading the guy next to him with another 10%, and in a position to threaten the next guy with 20%. We couldn't let that happen. It was obvious. We had to do it. The debate over whether we should have gotten involved in the Persian Gulf War looks ridiculously silly now. Of course we had to. That's why we did it. And to the extent that there are functional logics like that driving our interest and driving our involvement, they'll reapply. They'll reassert
even
themselves.
That was very contingent.
It was, I actually don't think in retrospect.
We had a huge army sitting in Germany with nothing to do.
we would have done something.
You know,
We would have done something.
a few years before then, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, that would have been an army that could possibly have had a lot to do in Europe, and we wouldn't have shipped it out to the Middle East to deal with Kuwaitis.
But in that particular, if it happened differently, yes. But grant the point that in 1990, 91, we had to do that. But the other kind of driver is not interest-based. It's sort of a feeling that we all have to. It's the media effect. It's our notion that we can't. It's a cognitive pull. We can't. Of course, we have to do something, like what you said with the refugees. Or it's not entirely clear to me that the interest-based arguments about U.S. intervention on the ground in the Middle East apply going forward as much as they have applied in the last couple of generations. Cold War, over. Israel can defend itself. Energy, increasingly unimportant for us, more for the rest of the world, but you could imagine a generation or two not as important. Proliferation, somewhat stabilized thanks to the Iran deal. War on terror, you can do that in an offshore way and different kind of tools. So, we stayed out of the Congo War. I don't recall great discussions here or elsewhere or in Washington about how we had to simply go in and solve the great war in Africa in the middle of the continent in the middle of the 1990s. Why do we have to solve? The American public isn't all that upset about staying out of Syria. The elites think this has been a horrible disaster. No one thinks it's been a great policy, but there's been no upsurge and upswelling of we need to go in and colonize Syria. So if the next president chooses not to get involved, I think they'll be able to. And I think the elites who have been used to getting involved and are going to have this interesting discussion about, is this really a habit that we've gotten into that we can break, or is it a necessary function that we need to actually be performing? And that's going to be a really interesting discussion. The question is whether the Middle East is part of the global periphery or whether it's part of the global core. We have never yet, in the last several generations, consigned it back to the periphery. But whether that might be happening is an interesting question.
I think we also need to weigh in that not only do we need to weigh the interests and see if we should push it aside and maybe focus at home, we need to also acknowledge we're really bad at this. As I tell people, aside from the fact that Americans are impatient, overly optimistic monolinguists, we're totally cut out for this role. The
fact that we had to import our imperial policeman specialist, tells you something. Yeah, if we had 5 zillion Emmas and Rory Stewarts, maybe we could do this kind of thing. But
Right, Browns ruled by Blues. Yeah. Anything else on this?
Do you want to police the Middle East?
Not personally, no. But I think
there's the problem.
Look, I think that the discussion of interests is really key here, and what the threats to those interests really are, and the degree to which those threats come out of the Middle East. And for me, looking at the horizon, it's difficult to identify both strong interests and serious threats. So, weak interest, weak threat, robust response doesn't compute.
Wait a second. So, okay, that's the most interesting thing you've said so far today. Response.
Possibly all month.
No, wait a second, because Emma, I think, has a different view, which is Steve just said that he doesn't see significant threats emerging out of the Middle East that would merit a robust American response. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree.
So why is he wrong?
Because he wants to willingly put his head in the sand. No, I don't believe it's such a great threat.
I do like the beach. That's.
I think the threat is overblown often. When you see the media coverage, you think, oh my God, they're coming to the shores at any moment. But when you look at the policy in Syria, the president didn't want to do anything until 2 Americans had their heads chopped off. And then there was that public outrage and felt compelled to respond. There will be more of those attacks. I mean, you saw what happened in Tunisia with Brits on a beach gunned down. If those had been Americans on the beach, I mean, Britain can't invade. It doesn't have an army anymore to do much about it. America does. And so if something like that happened where 30 Americans were gunned down on a beach somewhere, there would be a demand for something to happen. These things are going to happen. how we respond. We don't want to just continually be in that reactive mode, do nothing, a terrorist attack happens, we feel the need to go and invade two countries.
Yeah, I'm curious as to, I mean, it seems like there's an implication that there's, if you get, oh, am I on? Sorry. It seems to be implied that if you decide that you're going to be engaged and do something, it's going to be militarily. And I think that's a false choice. I don't think that's the only way to be involved. That's a way to be involved, but it's not the only way to be involved. And I think if you're a great country, you're able to, artfully combine all kinds of different ways that the United States influences the world in positive ways. And so I don't necessarily subscribe to it's either or, and I don't subscribe to it's if it is engaged, it's militarily. And I think that I grew up believing that the military was always the last choice of use of power, but it's always part of the calculus of American power and American engagement, allowing friends and allies to choose us as a security partner, to choose us as an economic partner, to choose us as a diplomatic partner. Those are important functions that can contribute to the next evolution of the Middle East.
I mean, look, no sane person could disagree with what you've said. The problem is that there's a dearth of sane people. Because, look at it this way. Apart from a military response, again, if you look at the drivers, the deep drivers of the ISIS phenomenon and the revolutions in the Middle East, you have to ask yourself, well, okay, if there's no military solution, and I agree with you, there isn't, what else is required? Well, the answer is certainly a lot of money, a mix on an enormous scale of public and private investment that could actually overcome the labor supply overhang, which is a real killer, and do something about that. Okay? Now, is the United States going to do that? Is Europe going to do it? Europe couldn't handle Greece. And they're supposed to handle an impoverished and anarchic Middle East. It's true that you have, a flood of migrants, and there will be another flood of migrants. Okay, well, what are Europe's options? They have three, it seems to me, broadly. And it's not the nuke 'em, surrender my option. Let's pretend we're not in the government. They can absorb those immigrants. They can say, okay, the world's changing, we need labor here anyway, so let's integrate these people into our societies. Or they can say, let's prevent these people from coming over by diminishing their incentive to come over. Okay, let's get in there big time with money and all kinds of assistance and really, as you had put it before in characterizing one of the policy responses, midwife a new Middle East from which people won't want to flee. Right now, Middle Easterners are voting with their feet. They just want to get out. Okay, what's the third option the Europeans have? Well, it's essentially a fence. It's it's a blockade.
Build a wall.
Build a wall. Exactly. And one of the first responses was, up the budget for EU maritime assets so they can better patrol Mediterranean waters and keep people out. So what do you think the Europeans are going to do? Which option are they going to take?
Yeah. Well, I would say that they've routinely in the past looked to us for part of the solution to that. And whether it's our leadership or our encouragement or our subsidy for figuring out the answer to that question. But in a lot of ways, you just kind of framed up compelling interests in contributing to the solution in Syria and not hiding behind our wall in North America. Okay.
I want to back up a step. I have no good answer to what the Europeans are going to do. But I think to say, I want to come back to Emma's, we're just not going to be able to resist. And I think what happened with this president in his return to Iraq is instructive. We had, I think, three factors that drew us back into Iraq. The first, as was brought up earlier, was the beheadings of a couple Americans. Gave outrage, gave a mass popular, who are these people and what are they doing? The second was what happened to the Yazidis. Everyone's sudden awareness that the Yazidis are besieged on Sinjar Mountain and that a mass slaughter and or starvation seems imminent. And the third was ISIL's, I think, very imprudent decision to decide to drive up towards Erbil, pushing through, the Peshmerga forces there, and threaten a town that the Kurds had quite deliberately made sure a number of U.S. oil companies had large operations in. I think this president would have resisted just one. I think it was just Erbil. He would have told them to evacuate. Maybe he could have resisted two. He could not resist the popular demands, I think, of all three, that he respond. Now, to his credit, I think we have gotten a little bit smarter about how we are doing this. Our current intervention in Iraq is much lower risk, is much safer, is much cheaper, is much easier to back away from, certainly, than an invasion of 150,000 troops. I think we have learned from watching what the Iranians did to us in Iraq. The Iranians never had more than 1,000 people in Iraq at any one time during our occupation, and yet they managed to present quite a considerable challenge to us. I think we've learned that perhaps we can do the converse as well. We now have less than 5,000 people there. They're doing training, they're helping equip, they're providing intelligence, and they're dropping a lot of bombs. And that's largely, and then a few special forces doing what special forces do, not just in that country, but everywhere around the world. So that strikes me as a much more prudent model that we can move forward on, that is fiscally acceptable, that involves many fewer troops. That may be a model moving forward.
Well said. We are about out of time, so what I'd like to do is get a big hand for a fabulous panel and a great discussion.